Okay, well, the first texture I made with the clay system was for Doom, and now Doom had pretty revolutionary graphics for its day, but the actual textures were, pretty simple, more or less smooth color fields. And so what I did is I took a pizza box and glued a bunch of junk from the junk drawer, like razor handles and lids and stuff like that, and glued that down. And then I gooped some car bondo and had it dripping down, kind of like some sort of slime or stalactites or something. Airbrushed that up and digitized it with the Snappy digitizer. And my brother was just learning to be quite the computer nerd at the time, and we found the right tools and imported it to Doom, and it was the coolest texture in the game. And so we knew we were onto something, and we modified the 8-bit palette in Doom to be a little more realistic, and we had something. It was time to run with it. So clay was the next thing. You couldn't make everything out of junk drawer parts, and started making texture sets for a level. The art at the time was rather random. I might have 3 or 4 related textures, but I didn't have a vision of exactly where I wanted to go. At the time, Doom was more fun as a deathmatch game, and I honestly was just screwing around at the time. I was actually a very good, pencil artist, and pretty well known in my high school. Won some awards for art, but nothing specifically to the clay system. The clay was a way to do color and not waste a lot of time with Photoshop. Actually, I used an art program called Fauve Matisse. It came with the Snappy camcorder digitizer. The key to the clay system was the airbrush. I had picked up a really nice airbrush and taken a class on airbrushing, and it was a pretty natural way to get color. Back I used to paint cars, and so spraying paint was pretty natural to me. And back then, the only other think about in real physical media, color was difficult to come by. You had to oil paint or use Prismacolors or something awkward like that. So you could airbrush the clay and get very, very, very interesting results. So generally, when we would make a texture, I would sketch out on paper a rough idea. I would either hand that off to Mary to do the clay work or do it myself. And we used spaghetti rollers to make flat sections, and we'd use Sculpey clay. Sometimes we'd use the sort of flesh pink colored Sculpey clay for things like pipes and computer stuff, and then the softer white Sculpey clay for rock. Perhaps we'd roll rocks around on it to give it a texture. Sometimes we would glue other items to it, and then bake it. Once it's baked, it would get airbrushed. The airbrushing consisted of sometimes automotive paint, which does not wash away when you use acrylic thinners on it. And so, sometimes we'd kind of use a wash system to get some dark colors down in the cracks and increase the contrast. Once the texture was painted up, we would digitize it with the Snappy. There were no digital cameras back then, and the Snappy had horrible resolution. Honestly, the textures in Gunman, the largest was 256 by 256. Even some of the video cards way back had a hard time with anything bigger than that. So that was the limit. And then you would put it into the art program and make it tile. That was a lot of the work. A high quality texture would tile easily, and one that we were sloppy with was a lot more work. One of the benefits of the clay texture process was consistency. If you tried to digitize real-life objects, you only could get what was available. If you wanted bricks and the old house that you were using to get your brick texture didn't have certain features, you weren't going to have them available. On top of that, generally you have all kinds of problems with shadows on things and all that. The clay, I could make literally anything. I could have skeletons embedded in the bricks if I wanted to. And the consistency was one part, but the other part was speed. I mean, depending on how much work you wanted to put into something, even something complicated like embedded bones in a brick wall, it didn't take an enormous amount of time, and it gave you the results. The way you painted it, the way you lighted it, gave you results you just really couldn't get in Photoshop without a huge amount of work. Some of the drawbacks with the clay system were sometimes I feel like some of the Gunman levels were almost too noisy. I probably should have thought about some smoother textures. The clay system, you could really get quite a bit of detail, and honestly, from an art point of view, you kind of want to mix busy with smooth for a pleasing scene, and I wouldn't say very many of my textures were smooth. One drawback with this technique is, you could have disasters with the physical textures. I remember I had hired my sister Mary to do some of the clay work, and then I would airbrush it and continue the rest of the work. She had a daughter who was in her terrible twos, and she had just finished this very complicated and beautiful texture for the rust flyer. And the daughter, wanting attention, had gone up and stuck her fingers in the clay and knocked it onto the floor, and big chunks of it came off of the cardboard, and it was ruined. And I think that she totally flipped out, and the little girl was mortified. And so there's one of your downfalls with the clay texture system. For the 3D meshes, most of the time Rainier would just build it in the 3D program, but there were occasions when we would make a actual clay model of the monster. The Gnome Grande, the big dinosaur, several of the monsters were done that way. And the trick was we had something called a microscribe, and it was basically a pointer. You could hit a pedal and it would digitize a point. And I was using a art program called a Mappy at the time, and you would just poke a lot of little dots in your clay model where you wanted to have a vertex, and digitize it that way. Nowadays we have ZBrush and stuff like that, so you wouldn't need to use this technique. But back then I think it came up with some pretty interesting results. The Gnome Grande was a pretty wild shape, so it really worked out with that one. But the microscribe was pretty expensive, and in the end, probably not worth it. Okay, so the T-Rex that we used in early Quake versions was animated by actually redigitizing the clay model in different poses. Bone animation back then was hard to come by, and I certainly couldn't do it in a Mappy. So the models in Quake were point cloud based. I mean, you didn't have a skeletal animation system. You had a 10 frames per second new version of the model for every frame. And so I came up with the redigitizing method, and it was horrible because you had to digitize the monster in exactly the same order, and even if you didn't have a lot of polygons, you know, a couple hundred vertices had to be in exactly the same order or you had to start over. So, yikes. Skyboxes were difficult because, I mean, the proper way to do it is you make a 3D model with a 90-degree camera sitting in the middle, and you just rotate it 90 degrees, and you have a skybox. All of the distortions are baked in. But, you know, trying to do it with clay is a little more difficult. I made the kind of yellow desert skybox using clay, probably about 18-inch wide sections per panel, and I just kind of did the art with distortions kind of baked in and just hoped they worked out. It actually did work pretty well, but it was a huge process. You know, days worth of work, and trying to get a feeling of distance using clay that's not really very three-dimensional. I mean, I think that thing got to be about 3 inches thick, possibly, worth of clay. And the clouds were made of cotton pulled out of a pillow. And it was kind of built into clouds, and then you digitize it and blur it a bit so you can't see the fibers. Yeah, pretty interesting results, but very difficult to do. When other people came on board with Gunman, a lot of them didn't even really know what I was doing with the textures. The programmers really had no idea until we got together for a mod convention put on by Valve, and I actually brought some of the textures with me and showed it to them. To be honest, I was rather paranoid about the idea. I didn't want it getting out and being used by bigger companies. When we went to Seattle, and we were with Valve for 3 months at the end of the production of Gunman, I was actually still producing textures, but I would do it back at the apartment, and I never really told Valve about how we made them. I think they figured they were oil painted or something like that. I don't know why. It seems pretty obvious that they were clay textures to me. I remember our contract when we signed over the rights to Gunman. You know, I specifically put in there that you know, that the techniques and things weren't included. Essentially, every single texture in the game is made of clay, with the exception of some of the computer displays and animated stuff. Very few of the monsters were made from clay, modeling clay, and digitized with the microscribe. But, you know, there was just about 0 textures that were made with Photoshop. After the game was done, the textures had just been put in boxes, and honestly, many of them decomposed. The Sculpey clay, you know, tends to get weak over years, and cracks appeared. The skins for the models were often broken up into small pieces, you know, for the UV layouts, and they looked stupid anyway, so we didn't really keep many of those. You know, if I was to say how many actual textures were there, it filled something like 10 boxes of carefully stacked textures. There was just a bazillion of them, and that was just the ones we kept. When I moved, I went through the boxes and discovered many of them were in pretty bad shape. Many of them weren't really worth keeping. They weren't, particularly beautiful in that state. And I put together 2 or 3 boxes of the best, and there was a trash can full of Gunman textures at one point when I was sorting them out in the garage. That was pretty much the end of the clay technology, and honestly, even to this day, I'm not sure how useful it would be. We're using physical-based rendering now, which is such a different system for creating textures. I had actually thought, after Gunman, of putting together a little graphic studio. Rather than making games, I'd thought maybe just doing textures as a subcontractor and hire more people like my sister who had some art talent and crank out textures on a large scale. But I was so burned out after Gunman that never happened.